another dimension. The language that the Bible uses to talk about another dimension is heavenly places. We sometimes think of it as the spiritual world, the supernatural world, the invisible world. That might be a good way of thinking of it. Another way of thinking of it is, I was telling some during the break, that if we were to think in terms of God and not God, those are two categories. And everything in not God is created by God. So that includes angels, that includes spirits, that includes celestial beings. And it would also include what we have called the spiritual world. Now, spiritual world is not really, technically, it's not really biblical language. That language doesn't appear so much. Maybe a little bit in Paul when he talks about the spiritual body of resurrection. But spiritual world is not really biblical language. So maybe instead of drawing a sharp distinction between the spiritual world and the physical world, or the supernatural world and the natural world, it would be better to think in terms of God and not God. And within that not God category includes this multiple dimensions of which you and I live in one of them. Now, when I talk about dimensions, if we just go back to geometry, you know, if you are a one-dimensional being, you could perceive a line. If you're a two-dimensional being, you could add to that line some height, and now you've got a square. And if you're a three-dimensional being, you could add depth, and now you have a cube. So a two-dimensional being could not see a cube. A cube would just look like a square to it. So you could show a cube to a two-dimensional being and say, this is a cube. Like, for instance, let's say you took a cube with 8 sides and 8 different colors, and you showed this cube to a two-dimensional being. So showed them, and you ask, what do you see? Oh, I see a green square. And then you flipped it around. What do you see now? I see a yellow square. What do you see now? I see a red square. Now, what if I told you that those 3 squares were all the same thing? They're all just sides. Sides, what's a side? Because a two-dimensional being has no concept of sides. They're just different sides of the same object. Right? So you and I live in a 3-dimensional world. In a 4-dimensional world, you would add an additional factor, and a 4-dimensional being, sometimes a 4-dimensional object has been described as a tesseract, and people have created videos of tesseracts, but they're not real, because you can't perceive a tesseract. It's a cube within a cube that rotates and can go in inside and outside of itself. You cannot see a tesseract. So people have tried to come to something close to it, but it's still like you looking a two-dimensional being looking at a square. A two-dimensional being can never see a cube, and a three-dimensional being can never see a tesseract. Right? So, but being in that 4th dimension, if we take out time, a being in that 4th dimension would be able to see inside of objects. And if you've seen the movie Interstellar tries to get at the idea, what would it be like if a human being could enter that 4th dimension? And so it's interesting. So when we talk about dimensions, when we talk about the spiritual world, maybe what we have traditionally called the spiritual world is simply higher dimensions of the not God creation. Right? So that would explain how physical objects could come from what we call the spiritual world, but is really just other dimensions. The book takes 3 full chapters to kind of try to unpack that, more than we can do here. But in talking about the spiritual realm, it's inhabited by various kinds of non-human entities. So if we're taking the interdimensional hypothesis, then what we're saying is these phenomena that are coming into our world, into our space-time continuum, are coming from that place, the celestial world, the spiritual world, as we as Christians describe it. And we know that beings in this realm, some are good, some are loyal to God, others are evil and hostile to God, which makes it then plausible that UFO phenomena are manifestations of the latter, of hostile beings who have entered our world to carry out some harmful purposes. Now, the next slide shows that the shorthand that we often use to describe this celestial world, we talk about angels and demons, and that's helpful shorthand, but it doesn't really grasp the complexity of the celestial beings that live in that world. So I'm just going to do a really quick survey of that world. And we'll go to the next slide, and we're just going to build this. Oh, okay, we're not going to build this. You get it all at once. So this had a really nifty, building thing. But so there are in the spiritual world messengers. So that's the literal word. That's the meaning of the word angel. An angel is a messenger. And so some celestial beings are messengers that are carrying out tasks for God. We know that it was angels who announced to Mary, for instance, that she would bring forth the Christ child into the world. There are cherubim who are, they're kind of like guards. They're kind of like the Secret Service. They're guarding the throne of God. They guarded the way into the Garden of Eden. So they have a kind of a guarding throne room security. They're the throne room security detail of heaven. Seraphim tend to be equated with the worship of heaven. Ophanim, that's the Hebrew word for Ezekiel's vision, the wheel within the wheel. And just a really interesting creature that on the one hand looked like, technology. A wheel is a form of technology, but is nevertheless alive and sentient, conscious, thinking entity, and is in some way associated with, again, the throne of God. Archangels, we mention these every Sunday in the Eucharistic prayer, right? Together with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. So this is the company of heaven, plus believers that are in heaven. So archangels, they're kind of high-ranking spirits in the celestial realm. Only one is mentioned by name, and that's, hold on, am I right? Gabriel is mentioned by name, I believe. I think it's the King James Version in Thessalonians, talking about the second coming, says the trumpet, the voice of the archangel. Most modern translations, including the ESV, say an archangel, which is probably a better translation. So there's more than one. And in Christian tradition, there's 7 that have been identified, but we can only talk about 2 for sure. And then there's the elementals. The Apostle Paul references these. I think it's in Philippians. It's Philippians or Colossians, I can't remember. He references elemental spirits. And then we find in Scripture spirits, angelic spirits, that are associated with the elements. So, for example, Revelation 16:5 talks about the angel of the waters. So these are beings that are in some way associated with the elements of nature. If you're a Tolkien fan, you know that the trees in The Lord of the Rings, you know, they're kind of semi-sentient beings. I don't think that's not exactly what we're saying here. But somehow angels are involved in managing the elements of the world. Now, most of us have been taught that that's all just kind of automatically taken care of by natural law. You know, God invented natural law, and then, you know, the world just kind of runs according to natural law. But a supernatural worldview suggests that maybe angels are more involved in the management of the elements of the world than we thought. The book of Revelation also talks about the angels of the winds, the 4 winds. We have angels that are associated with fire in Revelation 14, Revelation 8, Ezekiel 10. And if we go to Enoch, we have references to hail, snow, thunder, lightning, seas associated with angelic activity. So we're not really given a whole lot of detail beyond that kind of passing reference in Paul, but the worldview of Paul's day did assume that there were spirits associated with different parts of nature. And I think that we could perhaps assume that some of these are hostile to God and some of them are not. One of the things associated with Baal in the Old Testament is storms, Baal the storm god. Another element in this complex world are the watchers. They are referenced in the book of Daniel. We're not exactly told why they're called watchers, except that perhaps their duties are to. There are a number of times, there's at least one time in Scripture, maybe it's in Job, but angels, and maybe Hosea, the angels are sent out to go to and fro in the earth and then report back to God what's going on. So that could have some association with the watchers. When we get to Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God, which is a generic term for angels or celestial beings, the sons of God have relations with the daughters of men. Enoch tells us that those sons of God were watchers. And so maybe it's a kind of David and Bathsheba kind of scenario. They're out doing their watching, and they watch a little too much and end up in trouble and causing trouble. Paul mentions principalities, or maybe another way to say it would be princes. So a principality would be a geographic region, and a prince would be someone who is over that region. This is pictured very kind of clearly in Daniel, where Daniel encounters or is told about the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. These are not human princes. These are celestial beings that have oversight over a particular geographical area. A friend of mine who is involved in kind of spiritual warfare and deliverance ministry was dealing with a lady one time who was being harassed demonically, and they prayed all kinds of things and nothing seemed to be working. And then he asked her, do you ever engage in spiritual warfare of any kind? And she said, well, sometimes when I walk through my neighborhood, I pray. And I know what's going on in that house, so I pray about what's going there, and they belong to a cult, and I pray against the spirits there. So during her prayer walk, she's engaging all these things. And he said, well, let's just pray, and if anything comes to mind, just say it. And my friend, he prays, and he calls the demon forth and says, identify yourself. And immediately she says this word that comes into her mind. I can't remember what the word is, but let's say it's Axworth. Axworth. And he asks her, does that mean anything to you? And she said, yeah, that's the name of my subdivision. You know how they'll call subdivisions by, fancy names like Hampton Estates or something like that. So that's the name of my subdivision. So, territorial spirits, maybe they go right down to the level of neighborhoods in some cases. It's hard to say. But principalities are kind of territorial. And then powers. The word powers and the way powers is also used in the New Testament to describe government authorities. So it's possible that powers are celestial beings that are kind of working under principalities, so smaller regions. We're not really able to build a detailed biography of these beings. We can try to get glimpses based on what the word is and how the word's been used in other areas. I think that's on purpose. I don't think God wants us to get too much into the weeds on these things, although we are called to engage. Thrones. People that I've chatted with that are involved in spiritual warfare and deliverance often associate thrones with strongholds. And sometimes they have identified a throne as the next step after a stronghold. So if you think of this progression, Paul says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath, lest you give the devil a foothold. Right? So that's a foot in the door. If the foothold stays open too long, it can develop into a stronghold. And the suggestion is that if a stronghold is not dealt with, it can turn into a throne. That there's a measure of authority that a celestial being can have over a person because that person has made certain agreements, consciously or unconsciously, that has then allowed that entity to dominate. Dominions, similar to thrones. Counselors, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Counselors, that God has a divine council, celestial beings that he consults and that help him run the world. I would go back to the chocolate, chip cookie illustration, not because God needs to, but because God wants to. And then this is an interesting one, the one in the upper corner, keeper of secrets. He really is a keeper of secrets, because I only discovered him about 2 weeks ago. And he's hiding in Daniel chapter 8:13, which says this, then I heard a holy one speaking. So this is an angel, a celestial being of some kind. I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? Now, the little phrase, the one who spoke, I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke. So that's the first holy one, the one who spoke. The Hebrew word there is palonai, which is, it can be a proper name, but it literally means wonderful numberer, or it can mean counter of secrets or keeper of secrets. And the theory is, this is the theory, it's my theory anyway, that when, at the time of the Reformation, one of the problems that existed in that other church that needed to be reformed was a lot of attention given to saints and angels. And there were all kinds of saints' days and all kinds of angel days. And the translators of the King James Version didn't want to give them another angel to worship. And so this name gets obscured in the translation. And Palmoni does not make its way, translation-wise, into any of our translations. Now, there is an alternative rendering to this word Palmoni. Some trace the Hebrew words and say it can come to mean something like a reference to somebody that you don't want to name. So it becomes the Hebrew equivalent of the English so-and-so. Right. So then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to so-and-so, or the one who spoke, the other one. Some translations will go that way. Another holy one said to the other one. I just think the translation makes more sense if we put in the proper name, Palmoni, or the keeper of secrets. And notice that the context here is about the revelation of a secret. Primarily, and there's a lot of this in Daniel, sealing up the prophecies until the end of days. That's when they'll be unsealed. That's when they'll be revealed. So if this is referring to an angel, and I think it probably is, their primary job is cataloging these prophetic secrets and in charge of when their understanding would be unfolded. Let's talk a little bit about the first rebel. It's pretty typical in Christian theology to think in terms of one fall. We think in terms of the fall of Satan, and then a bunch of angels fall with him. Again, I think the biblical story seems to be more complicated than that. I think the biblical story includes actually multiple falls. And this is perhaps the first one. Now, that whole idea of Satan falling and a third of the angels coming with him, that primarily comes from Revelation chapter 13. But if we read Revelation 13 a little slowly, we see that it's really talking about the Christ events, his birth, resurrection, ascension, and so on. And that there's a great cosmic battle in the heavenlies that takes place around the time of Christ coming into the world and during his life and during his ascension, and that there could have been a fall. The scripture says he took a third of the stars with him. Stars is a frequent reference to angels. God is often called the Lord of hosts, which is a reference to stars, but it's also a reference to angels. So that idea that there was this one fall, Satan fell and took a third of the angels with him, that's based on Revelation 13. But that's not really talking about the initial fall. It's talking about a battle that takes place during the time of Christ. So to talk about the first rebel, most historically Christians have gone to Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. So Ezekiel 28 is an oracle against the king of Tyre. It's actually about a human being. But then in verse 12 of Ezekiel 28, the language changes. And the king is described in terms that seem to go beyond human. He's said to have been in Eden, the garden of God, to have been clothed in every precious stone, to be an anointed guardian cherub, so one of the cherubim, to have walked on the holy mountain of God. He's described as being blameless until sin is found in him. And this is because of his pride and corruption, and he is cast down as something profane. So this description attributed to the king of Tyre appears to transcend an earthly biography. And then we get something similar in Isaiah 14, where the oracle is against, this time, the king of Babylon. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars, above the angels, and I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly. That's the divine assembly, the divine council. In the far reaches of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. This one in Isaiah 14 is called the day star, the son of dawn. And when that's translated into Latin, you get the word Lucifer. So Lucifer is the bright and shining one. And then later in Christian theology, Lucifer becomes Satan. Now, I don't think that either Ezekiel 28 or Isaiah 14 is a direct biography of Satan. It's about the king of Tyre and the king of Babylon. But these two human kings are earthly reflections of a deeper story. The story of the fall of Lucifer, who became the serpent in Genesis 3, I think is passed down in Israel's oral history. Everybody knows the story. Everybody reading Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, they know the story about the fall of this being. A fall that took place in a pre-Adamic world, because all appearances are in Genesis that the serpent, the devil, Satan, Lucifer, exists before Adam does. He's already there in the created order. So the kings of Tyre and Babylon, as human beings, they echo the trajectory of a supernatural being who once sought to exalt himself above God. So people are aware of the story of this rebellious celestial being. The kings of Tyre and Babylon are, the essence the oracle is saying is, you're just like him. Your actions are reflecting what he has done. What you are doing on earth, he has already done in the heavens. So I think this is the best scriptural account that we have of the first of many rebels or rebellions in the celestial world. Let's talk about another one. And in this one, we're going to explore the origin of demons. I mentioned in the morning session that demons are a particular class of beings in biblical understanding, the ones that function in the immediate atmosphere and in the earthly realm, whereas the principalities, powers, dominions, the watchers, those tend to be more associated with higher levels of involvement in the higher heavens. So it's going to take a little bit of time to get to the answer, origin of demons, and our starting place is going to be Genesis chapter 6. Verses 1 to 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men and bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. There's two primary views of what's going on here in Genesis chapter 6. One is that it's referring to Canaanite men who marry Sethite women. So it's a reference to purely, natural events, but the descendants of the Canaanites, they're really bad because Cain was bad, and the descendants of Seth, they're really good because Seth was good, and so it's just a bad marriage. It's like your good daughter marrying a bad boy. So that's kind of a very human way of looking at this. The other way of looking at this is that this is a reference to the watchers, to celestial beings who are intermarrying with women in which case the reference to the sons of God is a reference to angels. Now, nowhere in the Old Testament are human beings ever called sons of God, but angels are called sons of God all the time. So my proposal is that it's this second category, the second interpretation, that these are fallen celestial beings having physical relations with human women. I believe that's the correct interpretation. And I think it's the interpretation that is backed up by the New Testament. Further into the story, the next slide on the Nephilim. So the Nephilim are the offspring of these relationships. So if we take the purely, human interpretation, then the Nephilim are simply mighty human warriors. But if we take the interdimensional interpretation, then the Nephilim are actually human angelic hybrids. They are beings that are created out of a relationship between celestial beings and human beings, so that you get the result is a hybrid being who is both human and celestial. That is not a completely unbiblical concept. If we want to stretch your minds a little bit, if we think of some of the visions that some of the prophets have, the living creatures around the throne room have both animal faces and human faces. It seems to be some kind of a hybrid being. But there's a difference between a hybrid being created by God and a hybrid being that is created out of sin and out of rebellion. So why do we know that the fallen angel interpretation is the correct one? A couple of reasons. One is that this was the view in Jesus' day. This would have been the view that, if you walked up to your rabbi in Nazareth and said, "Hey, Rabbi, explain Genesis 6, he would have given you, those are the fallen watchers who married with women, and they had Nephilim, and so on. That would have been the interpretation. It was just the interpretation of Jesus' day. This interpretation is fully lined out in the book First Enoch. This is a book that originated during the Second Temple period, so 300 to 200 years, 200 to 300 years before Christ. And again, that the worldview of Enoch continues into the New Testament. The book is attributed to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, but hardly anybody believes that Enoch actually wrote it. So it is common in ancient writings to name a book after someone that you might acknowledge as being the originator of the ideas of the book. So, I certainly can't make this as a claim, as a truth claim, because I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But the idea would be the ideas maybe originated with Enoch, and the stories get passed down, and they get written down, and then they get kind of collected together in the Second Temple period. The book of Enoch is not scripture. I wouldn't use Enoch to build doctrine. But it's interesting when Enoch says things that seem to confirm what are in the New Testament. It was taken seriously in the early church. Many church fathers quoted it: Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus. And so did Peter and Jude in the New Testament, quote from it. Now, the part of Enoch that's of interest to us is Enoch chapter 6, 1 to 6. And what Enoch is attempting to do here is offering us more information, potentially, about what happened in Genesis 6. So I think we have this on the screen. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semjaza, who was their leader, said to them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together and bound themselves by mutual curses upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared. Jared is one of the descendants of Adam mentioned in Genesis. Descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual curses upon it. So that's the backstory as claimed by Enoch. 200 angels fall. So now we're at our third fall now, aren't we? So we had the fall of Lucifer, and then we have the rebellion of Revelation 12, which takes place during the time of Christ. And now here is a third occasion when angels rebel and fall. As Enoch unfolds, the Nephilim become these great giants that live in the land. And these giants are mentioned in many places. In Deuteronomy, remember the spies go into the land. They said there are giants there. They're referring to Nephilim. There seems to be some spin-off tribes, the Raphaim, the Anakim. There's 3 or 4 other tribal groups that are associated as descendants of the Nephilim. And in Jewish thinking, in Jesus' day, it is this great sin of Genesis 6 that produces so much evil in the world and precipitates the need for the flood. So there's sin in the world from Adam, but there seems to be this acceleration because of this angelic fallen angel incursion in Genesis 6. Now, this worldview is backed up by the New Testament. Peter, 2 Peter, God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell. This is a reference back. Or Jude 6, the angels who did not stay with their own position of authority, he is kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. These are either direct quotes or paraphrases from Enoch, the book of Enoch. When Enoch talks about how these fallen angels, these fallen watchers, they're buried in the earth and kept in dungeons and chains. And then 1 Peter 3 tells us that Christ proclaimed to the spirits in prison, the ones who formerly did not obey. This being a reference in essence, at the time between Christ's crucifixion and his resurrection, during that 3 days, he descends into the netherworld and announces to these, he's not witnessing to them, he's not preaching the gospel to them, but he is informing them, you really have been defeated, and your final judgment is approaching. Well then, that then leads us to the origin of demons. 1 Enoch 15 records that the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim are the origin of what we call demons. So demons in this, from an Enochian perspective, and this would have been the view of people in Jesus' day, demons are not fallen angels. They are the spirits of the Nephilim who die. So they are the spirits or the souls of these hybrid beings, which might explain why they want to indwell human beings and why they're so attracted to human beings. And this is outlined in 1 Enoch 15. I've got the quote. I don't think we'll read it for the sake of time. Let me talk about the divine council. Actually, maybe let me just stop there, and maybe there are some thoughts or questions on what we've considered. It's 1 Peter 3, 19 to 20. Yeah, question was, what was the last scripture reference that I cited? Are we good to carry on? Okay. Well, maybe we'll read this then. If we have, maybe just go back to the first Enoch 15. It says, "And now the giants who were born from the spirits and flesh will be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth will be their dwelling. Evil spirits have come out from their bodies," that is, out of the bodies of the Nephilim, "because they are born from humans and from the holy watchers," or holy is before they fell. "Their beginning is of primal origin. They will be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits they will be called. The spirits of heaven, in heaven is their dwelling, but the spirits of the earth who were born on the earth will be called evil spirits. The spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth and cause trouble. They take no food, but still hunger and thirst and cause offenses. These spirits will rise up against the children of men and against women because they have proceeded from them." Now, I said, demons are not fallen angels. They are the spirits or souls of the dead Nephilim. Now, having said that, when we're dealing with people that are being oppressed by demons or spirits, I don't think that this distinction is that important, right? Whether you break your arm because you slipped on a banana peel or you crashed your bike makes no difference to the doctor. He's going to treat it the same way, right? So the origin of demons doesn't really affect how we deal with them, which is to cast them out. All right, I think this is a natural time for me to stop. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back for our final session. So I'll call you back for our final session. So let's talk a little bit about the divine council. When we were looking at the complexity of the celestial world, one of the things we mentioned was counselors. So I want to take you to Psalm 82 and verse 1. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now, this verse has some interesting challenges for us because the Hebrew word Elohim, the word for God, appears twice. Now, the word Elohim, translated God in our Old Testament, it's a neutral word. It doesn't mean the God of creation. It can mean a false god. It can mean a pagan god. It's just like the neutral word for God. It appears twice in verse 1. God has taken his place in the divine council in the midst of the gods, same word, Elohim. So the word appears twice. And the thing about the word Elohim is it can be singular or plural. It's in that way, it parallels our English word deer. Right? You can have one deer or 5 deer. The same word can be singular or plural. So Elohim can be singular or plural. So the first mention of Elohim in Psalm 82:1 refers to God, Yahweh. It's singular. So whether it's singular or plural is determined by the context. The second use refers to a group of Elohim. And that's why we get the translation gods. And how do we know it should be plural? Well, because of the modifying phrase, in the midst of. You can't be in the midst of one other being. So in the midst of Elohim indicates that the second use of Elohim should be translated as gods, as plural. So here we have this divine council with the Most High God and other celestial beings that are called gods, small g gods. So they are not gods in the way that Yahweh is God. They're not all powerful. They're not all knowing. They are high-ranking celestial beings. Are they angels or are they something a little higher than angels? It's hard to tell. We're not given all the information. But we have this divine council. By the way, this is not a fringe subject. It's been studied by serious scholars for many years. It's been made popular through the writings of Michael Heiser, who has taken some of that literature and written some books that are very accessible. And in fact, it's through an article in the Anchor Bible Dictionary written by Michael Heiser that I was introduced to this idea of the divine council. So what are the functions of this council? There are many. I can just touch on a few today. But one of them is shared decision-making. 1 Kings chapter 22, the prophet Micaiah shares a vision of the heavenly council. And in the vision, Yahweh is sitting on the throne. He's surrounded by the host of heaven. And he asks the council, who will entice King Ahab to go into battle so that I may fall? And a spirit steps forward and says, I'll do it, and this is how I'll do it. So on the one hand, God has made the determination, the sovereign God has made the determination, this is going to happen. But how it's going to happen is offered by the council. Something similar in Daniel 4, where God decrees judgment against King Nebuchadnezzar. But he leaves the council to decide what the judgment should look like. And Daniel 4:17 describes this. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers. That's these members of the council are also called the watchers. The decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of man and gives it to him, sets and so on. So, and they're the ones that decide, okay, he's going to go crazy. He's going to have a mental breakdown, think he's an animal. We used to think that was crazy. That's actually pretty popular now for people to think that they're animals. I watched a video on YouTube of a guy get pulled over by a cop, and he was asked for his name and identity, and the fellow in the car says, "Just so you know, officer, I identify as a cat." And he says, "In that case, I'll call the SPCA, and they'll come down and take you to their place and give you a rabies shot." Anyway, that's off topic. So functions of the council: shared decision-making, regional governance would be another one. Daniel chapter 10, we refer to that. The prince of Greece, the prince of Persia, and so on. The principalities, shared governance over parts of the world. Well, as we continue to read in Psalm 82, we see that some of these beings involved in governance are miserable failures. Psalm 82, verses 2 to 4, how, this is God now, chastising the divine council or some members of the divine council. It may not be the whole council, but some members of the council. And he chastises them and says, "How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the deaf." They're doing a terrible job at managing their territories. And all of this leads to a pronouncement of judgment in verse 7. "Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince." So we have this idea of a divine council that assists God. God doesn't need the assistance, but God in his sovereignty has chosen to delegate these duties to celestial beings and also then to humans who are told to take dominion, be fruitful, multiply, take dominion of the earth. He delegates. Well, what leads to this failure, this breakdown? It's like, okay, we almost have another fall here, another failure in the celestial realm. So it's more complicated than just saying, Satan fell and took a third of the angels. Seems to be multiple instances. Well, what leads to this dramatic scene in Psalm 82 where God is calling out these entities? How did the nations come to be under the oversight of these spiritual entities in the first place? And why were they entrusted with such significant authority only to fail so spectacularly? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to Deuteronomy 32, verses 7 to 9. "Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, he will show you, your elders, they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage." So in verse 7, there's an appeal to oral history. Remember the days of old, right? So these are the stories that have been passed down, the ones told to you by your fathers and told to you by your elders, the ancient stories. And one of those stories is then in verse 8, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind. This is a reference to the Tower of Babel. But notice this next sentence gives us some new information that we don't get in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel. When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So he divides up the nations And he then appoints, he divides them into as many as there are sons of God, these angelic beings that are assisting in governance. And he appoints them over these nations. And then in verse 8, Yahweh claims Israel for himself. He says, I'm delegating you guys over the nations, but I'm going to take personal responsibility for Jacob, Israel. So that's the backstory to Psalm 82. Deuteronomy 32 tells us how this originates, what the setup was. But Psalm 82 tells us that there's a breakdown and a failure, and we could write several books on the whole theme of the nations and the gods of the nations. And tomorrow in church, I'm preaching from the prophet Haggai on the subject of shaking the nations, of how God is now reclaiming the nations from celestial beings that are messing things up and from human beings that form human empires of evil under their influence. So the celestial world is complex. We're talking about this other dimension from which UFOs and beings may be coming. It's a complex world, probably more questions than answers. So from that, let me transition to the occult connection. I feel like this is another piece of the argument that fortifies the idea that most UFO, UAP phenomena can be explained in terms of celestial beings that are hostile to God, who became hostile to God through one of these many different fallings that we have described. And the fact that there is such a significant occult connection with ufology, especially its early days. So I'm not so much now with the scientists, but with the early days is quite remarkable. So Aleister Crowley was a British occultist, was the founder of magic with the K. This is known in occult circles as the left-hand path. So this is the really evil, black, dark stuff. He was the founder of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He was obsessed with the idea of incarnating the goddess Babylon, the Scarlet Woman of Revelation, to be his magical soulmate. He is the originator, and most occultic movements in some way or another will trace their origins, at least in part, back to this guy. There's earlier origins than that he appealed to. He appealed mostly to Egyptian and Babylonian magical sources. But he's the guy that kind of brought it into the modern world. When he got married, he and his wife did a honeymoon in Cairo, Egypt, at which time an entity called Aiwass appeared to him and dictated his book called the Book of the Laws. And then another being appeared to him. I think we have a picture of that being, which he sketched in his writings. And this being identified itself by the name Lamb. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to show you another image of a being who appeared during a UFO summoning ritual and looks very much like this. But let me give you some other key names. Jack Parsons is another fellow involved. He was an American rocket engineer, a chemist. He's associated with the California Institute of Technology. He is the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Okay, so these are not like 30-year-olds living in their parents' basement playing video games. I mean, these are pretty smart people involved in science. He invented the first rocket engine. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory later became part of NASA. But he was also a devoted follower of Aleister Crowley and believed in using ritual magic to make contact with non-human entities, and claimed that some of his technology insights were given to him by these entities. He was really close friends with Ron L. Hubbard, who founded Scientology. In fact, his wife left him for Ron L. Hubbard, so Ron L. Hubbard wasn't like a great friend. But George Adamski was involved in esoteric occultist religion, theosophy. He claimed he was one of the first that gave stories of being a UFO abductee. Now, I didn't grab these names selectively. Like, these are the names of the people involved in the early days of ufology. And it's like, oh, and by total coincidence, they're all involved in the occult. George King, London cabbie, said he was driving along when a voice popped into his head. That's always dangerous. Prepare yourself, you are to become the voice of the Interplanetary Parliament. And he ends up forming the Etheria Society, which is still around, and members conduct rituals to store psychic prayer energy in batteries, which they then release into the earth. He was involved in the occult. George Van Tassel quit his job as an inspector with the Lockheed Aircraft in 1947, moved his family to an isolated spot in the Mojave Desert, and started getting telepathic messages from what he called were space beings. The most notable was Ashtar. He later became involved in the abductee movement. Some have noted that the name Ashtar sounds a lot like Ashtaroth in the Old Testament, one of the Canaanite gods. And Ashtar is mentioned in old grimoires. Grimoires are kind of demonic encyclopedias that occultists use to catalog demonic spirits. By the way, there are some very popular fantasy games, fantasy board games, fantasy video games. A lot of the characters in these games are actually taken from these grimoires. They're the actual name of actual entities. Perhaps today, most of these guys are dead except for Stephen Greer. He is a prominent voice in the UFO movement today. He's an emergency room physician. He's been involved in a lot of documentaries. He has a lot to do with the congressional hearings that are taking place, is an advocate for full disclosure. But he is also an advocate of something called CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. Now, most of us are familiar with the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right? So that name, Close Encounters of the First, Second, Third Kind, is an actual classification system that was invented by Alan Hynek. He's one of the scientists that I mentioned earlier when we were going through the list of scientists. So in classifying UFO encounters, he came up with a 3-scale classification system. So Close Encounters of the First Kind, hope I can remember all these, but this is where you're a passive observer of something in the distance. That would describe, I guess, my experience at Lake Okanagan, a CE1. A CE2, I can't remember, but it includes maybe some kind of contact. CE3, I don't remember. It's in the book. I think CE4 has something to do with being abducted, and then CE5 is where Stephen Greer comes in. Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind involves human beings initiating the contact. So it's no longer human beings being subjects of the contact, but human beings initiating the contact. Now, it just so happens, another coincidence, that Stephen Greer is a master teacher of transcendental meditation and was personally trained by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. So another occult connection. And what he does is he takes groups of people out, usually in parts of the world where there's an unpolluted sky, so often in desert regions where there's not a lot of cities around. And then he leads people into a meditative state. And then this is how he describes it. He says, in that meditative state, I begin to imagine, or I begin to let myself see in my mind a craft or a light or an orb or something. And then, like an air traffic controller, I, in my mind, vector it to my location. I start pulling it towards me. Now, the interesting thing about these CE5 encounters is that they can be easily verified because they take cameras along with them, and sure enough, pretty soon, lights, being crafts, begin to appear. Now, this is a different technique, but if what I've been suggesting up until now is true, this is just a more sophisticated 21st century, a version of drawing a pentagram, lighting some candles, and chanting to demons, right? It just looks way more innocent and not as scary as that, but they're essentially doing the same thing. Chris Bledsoe, I do a whole section on him in the book, was a leader in his local Pentecostal church when he started having these lights appear to him. He has since kind of abandoned, he says he hasn't, but he has. He's abandoned Orthodox Christianity, believes that this is a feminine energy bringing new light and new messages to the world. You can find, he's written a book, but you can find videos, Bledsoe, B-E-L-D, so where he's gone out with scientists. They put electrodes onto his mind because they want to see what's happening in his brain when this is happening, and he just sits quietly, and pretty soon these orbs and lights begin to appear. Right? So this is CE5. This is summoning. This is inviting. I think I have a picture. It's hard to see, but up in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of a floating being that appeared during one of these summoning events. And these beings, as they have appeared, are both solid and not solid at the same time, which accounts for the unclear features. But you can clearly see the head and the arms, and the eyes and the nose and the mouth on the one in the upper left-hand corner. And then another one is the one in the right-hand corner, and it's hard to see, but I've tried to highlight the shape of the face and where the eye is and where kind of the beak-like nose is, and it does bear some resemblance to lamb. Well, let me finish up with what our response should be to all of this. First of all, we should be on our guard, because the scriptures do say that in the end of days, there will come a strong delusion. In 2 Thessalonians 2, 9 to 11, talks about the coming of the lawless one. This would be another name for what John in his epistles calls Antichrist, or what John calls in the book of Revelation the beast, the lawless one. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all the wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be deceived. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false. I do not know what that strong delusion is. And so what I say now, I say as pondering. This is me thinking out loud, not making a declaration. But it certainly seems to me that one scenario that this strong delusion could play out with would have something to do with UFOs. If the world becomes convinced, and by the way, sightings are growing rapidly. The information is there if you want to see it. But if the world becomes convinced that UFOs are friendly, and quite a few people think they are friendly, Stephen Greer thinks they're friendly, that these are beings from other realms and other planets that are coming to help us, they're friendly. If the world becomes convinced that they are friendly, bringing enlightenment, and an Antichrist figure presents himself as their messenger, then that could certainly be a scenario that would shift the world to give its allegiance to a one-world figure. Or, conversely, if the world becomes fearful of UFOs and thinks of them in terms of hostile beings coming to attack us or do something bad to us, once again, a world leader who claims to have a solution could certainly coalesce loyalty around himself. And one thing, if you want to coalesce loyalty, you need a common enemy. And so that certainly is a possible scenario that could be used. In Luke 21, we get a description of the world just prior to Christ's coming. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars and on the earth, distress of nations in perplexity. Verse 26, people fainting with fear, with the foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. I've never really noticed that little phrase, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. The word powers there is the same word that Paul uses when he describes celestial beings, principalities, powers. So it may be that Luke is referring to something more than just atmospheric upheaval, but the powers of the heavens, hostile forces in the heavenly places will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. It seems that there's some kind of celestial being event of some kind that occurs in association with or prior to the coming of Christ. So we should be on our guard. Paul highlighted how Satan disguises himself and is an angel of light, and unfortunately, Chris Bledsoe seems to have been deceived by that. Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. The Greek word that Paul uses there is metaskidmatzo, which literally could be translated as shapeshifter. Meta is change, skidmatzo, meta, I forgot the word. Metamorph, schismatzo, something like that. Anyway, look it up. It could mean shapeshifter, something that shapes. Some of the other translations, instead of disguises himself, transforms himself. Change, form. Transform. And so just because some of these appearances might appear to be friendly doesn't mean that they're good. My final point to you is please don't go down the rabbit hole. Avoid speculative teachings that do not build up the faith. I think if you read my book, you'll notice a cautious tone in it, maybe more cautious than when I'm talking about it. But I try to take a cautious tone. 1 Timothy 1:4 talks about being careful not to devote yourselves to myths and speculations rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith. So, we can certainly have conversations. I engaged in a little bit of speculation, when I said strong delusion, well, maybe it could be this. But what I'm not doing is I'm not going to devote myself to speculations. Rather, I'm going to devote myself, and so should you, to the stewardship that you have from God. That's your calling. What has God called you to? Some people talk about two circles, the circle of concern and the circle of influence. Your circle of influence should be a lot bigger than your circle of concern. There's things that I'm concerned about. Aliens from outer space. I'm concerned about that. But that does not live in my circle of influence, so I can't do anything about that. So what can I influence? I can influence my daily walk. I can influence my marriage. I can influence my relationships. I can influence how much I read and study Scripture and stay informed and so on. I grew up as a Christian. I came from a Pentecostal background, and there were wise Pentecostals and there were unwise Pentecostals. And the wise Pentecostals would say sometimes, it doesn't matter how high you jump when you praise the Lord. What matters is how straight you walk once you land. So that's what we need to be focusing on. devote yourselves to the stewardship that you have from God. You can study this. You can look at it. You can be sure that you don't get deceived by it. Don't give up your Christian worldview like some will maybe do when they become people that have not immersed themselves in Scripture, are not strong in the Lord. Suddenly, a UFO appears over their house and their whole worldview changes, and now they don't believe in God anymore. This is the reality. That's what we need to guard ourselves against. And then beware of prideful disputes that lead to division. Also in Timothy, if anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the teaching that accords with godliness, he's puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy. So that's something we want to avoid. This topic does not fall within the realm of the creeds, right? This is not the stuff that is most to occupy our minds and our thinking, but it's also not unhelpful to be informed because when you put on that armor of God, it partially helps to know what you're fighting. So, in conclusion, this is what I think we've seen. UFOs appear to be real and active on Earth. The beings behind them likely emerge from a parallel hidden realm. This idea of a hidden realm fits with Christian teaching about the unseen world. UFO phenomena are best understood as hostile spiritual activity. UFO encounters are closely tied to the occult and dark forces. And finally, we should respond by trusting Christ's victory and avoiding deception. So maybe we have a little bit of time. There's a few questions that people have wanted to ask. We have some time to maybe consider some of those. Yes, 4-question guy. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I want one of those for Christmas. Right. Hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Hmm. Right. Yeah. Hmm. Right. Interesting. Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, your question about um, where do megalithic structures like the pyramids fit in to this, I have, it's one of the many chapters or topics that didn't get in the book because um, this is a rabbit hole. So every topic that you look at opens up other questions. But I think that particular question is worthy of exploration. I haven't thought of it in terms of advanced technologies in earlier civilizations. I'd be willing to look at that. For me, the thing that's captured my attention is the dating of some of these structures. Um, there's a big one in Turkey and some other places that if we go with a fairly literal dating of the events in the Bible, which I tend to do, that doesn't mean I believe the world's only 6,000 years old. I think it could be, how many millions and millions of years, but I'm talking about human history. Some of these megalithic structures do raise questions because some of them would predate Adam by 12,000 years. So then that does raise questions about a pre-Adamic civilization. That's not a topic brand new to Christians. I'm not sure where to go with it. I want to go somewhere with it. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but some Hebrew scholars are, pretty adamant that Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 don't make room for a gap. So I'm talking about something called the gap theory. So the gap theory is that Genesis 1:1 is the creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. I believe it's Jeremiah says that when God created the world, it was not without form and void. So some have proposed that in between God creating the heavens and the earth, which he would have created perfectly, the world became formless and without void. And so they argue that the word was could be translated became. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth became void and dark. And then, so talking about a pre-Adamic civilization that is maybe destroyed. And then Genesis continues on with what is essentially a recreation. So starting again with Adam. So there's a pre-Adamic civilization that is accounted for in that gap. So, oh man, I hope it's true because it just answers a lot of questions. But I can't force that word was to mean became. Now, it can do that in some context. So some Hebrew scholars, like Michael Heiser, who's kind of a bit of a hero to me, says impossible translation. It's possible grammatically, but in that verse and context, it's an impossible translation. There are other Hebrew scholars that are just as smart as him that argue otherwise. So I'm undecided. Yeah. Sure. An age, yeah. No. Hmm. Right, right. I haven't thought that far into it because I'm hung up on the time thing. So there seems to be credible evidence at archaeological dig sites of civilizations that existed before Adam. Seems. There might be indications in Genesis. It's hard to say. Like Cain, it's pretty early on in the family line, right? But he goes off to a city. It's like, well, where did that city come from? So those are some things that are occupying my mind a little bit. They don't show up in my Sunday preaching because they fall under speculation, and people just want to know how to make it through their day. But it is definitely something thinking about. Did I see another hand over here? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah, all of them. Yeah, I think the question was about, have I thought about megalithic structures? I have, but not so much the structural component, more so the dating of them. Yeah. The which? Cain? Yeah, please. Yeah. 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 That's very plausible, very plausible. And then on the other hand, is they seem to function as a nomadic family system where being sent out is a curse. Right? So Cain is sent out, and it's a curse. It's a bad thing. But it's entirely plausible that the city that he went to was built by his siblings. Yeah, so some translations say that he built the city, some don't. So there's a little bit of blurriness in the Hebrew structure. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Okay. So the question was trying to clarify what I mean by extra dimensions. And I spend 3 or 4 chapters in the book. I spent very little time on it here, but it's interesting. It's this field that I have the most questions on during the breaks and stuff. So this is how I think about it currently. Well, this is how I used to think about it. I used to think about it this way, that there are kind of these two categories. There's the physical world and there's the spiritual world. The physical world is visible, the spiritual world is invisible. The natural world is natural, this world is supernatural. So you got visible, invisible, natural, supernatural, physical, spiritual. That tended to be my 2 categories. Currently, my 2 categories are God and not God. And everything in not God is created by God, which includes angels. Everything is created by God. And within this created order are multiple dimensions. We live in the 3rd dimension. We're 3-dimensional beings. But there are other dimensions that go beyond 3. And scientists can calculate, like if you lived in the 4th dimension, you would have these increased capabilities. The movie Interstellar tries to experiment with that. And then if you lived in the 5th dimension, you would have these capabilities. And they work their way up to, I think, up to 11 dimensions. What are they at? 11 dimensions, something like that. 16, I don't know. But, when you get way up there, you basically have a description of God. You have something that is capable of knowing everything, being everywhere, all at the same time, etc. So what we have called the spiritual world, which is not biblical language, actually, that the phrase spiritual world is not really there. Closest we get is heavenly places. But what I'm wondering is if what we have called the spiritual world, dimension 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, we can call it that, that's fine, but what it really is just higher dimensions and higher capabilities within the not God category. So that's where I am currently. I'm really open to being educated and inform. But to me, because the problem I was trying to solve was, how does a physical object come from the spiritual world into the physical world? And say, well, maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it's more, how does a physical object come from the fourth dimension into the third dimension? Maybe that's the right question. So, thinking of it that way helps me answer that question. Of course, it creates a bunch of other questions then, but I can only do one question at a time. Yes? Okay. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Hmm. Hmm. Right. Hmm. Or it could have been the Men in Black. Yes. Interesting. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Thank you. That's very kind. Appreciate that. Okay. Well, I think, yes, we are 1 minute past time. So thank you very much, Stephen.
Ken assured me that his book will answer every question you might have. He promised it. This draft, at least. If you wait 3 days, the next draft might. But they're $12. I think there's a limit of 3 on Amazon. So buy 3 copies. They go up to $30. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.